Hey, welcome back, y'all. So today we're talking about VAR in JavaScript. So if you're coming from Python, it's going to feel oddly familiar, but also dangerous in some ways. And I'm going to break down exactly why the industry moved from VAR to let and const. Check this out. So first things first, right? Let's look at the syntax. So up top on Python, you have your variable expression. That's going to be called name. Equals, and then the value, the string that's in there is going to be array. Now in JavaScript, the old version, you have var name equals array. So the same thing, but you have to declare it first by var. Basically all we're doing is just saying, hey, create a box and hold the data that we're putting to the right of the operator, the equal sign, within that variable name that we're making. So var doesn't actually fit modern coding standards anymore, but it was made in 1995 over a span of 10 days, right? And that's all we had initially back then was var. So at that time, there was no let or const. It was just var. And it was very loose compared to coding languages like Java or C++. So let's use the room analogy. So to understand the problem, think of a block of code, like an if statement or a loop as a room. So the curly braces are the wall. And in a perfect world, if you create a variable inside of a specific room, it stays in that room. It shouldn't wander off to the rest of the house. So we've talked about it a few times before. All our code is staying within those curly brackets, right? So everything within that function, within that block of code is staying parent to that function, right? It's not leaking out. It's not going anywhere else. Because if it did, it would kind of create chaos, right? So var does that exact same thing, and that's the problem. It ignores the curly brackets. So this is kind of normal when it comes to Python, but not in JavaScript. And JavaScript is a little bit different. So let's look at this example for a second, right? For instance, if we labeled X something else down in the block of code, and it wasn't surrounded in this curly bracket, and we had another section that had it as well for X and defined it as 20, the problem is a console log is going to take whatever's next. That's an issue, right? Because now you're saying you have to only use a different expression, a different naming convention instead of X, so you can't use it again. So you have to be unique in that manner. Hoisting is also something that Python would never tolerate, right? So in Python, you print a variable before you define it. The program crashes immediately. And in JavaScript with var, it doesn't crash. It stays undefined. And it pretends a variable exists, but it's empty. And this hides bugs instead of actually fixing them. So if you're looking for a few reasons on why you actually need to avoid var, here's 3 of them. So it's redeclaration, right? So you can define the same variable twice in the same scope, like we talked about, and var is not going to warn you. It's just going to silently override that data. So if you had good data that you needed to propagate from the first block of code, and then you had something else later down the road that someone else built, that first block of code is just gone, right? So you're not going to be able to call that one. And that's a problem with var, especially if you're using it throughout your entire block of code. Global pollution. So if you use var at the top level, it attaches it to the window object, meaning any script on the page can mess with it. Huge issue there, right? So obviously 2 red flags so far, and then hard debugging. So because it leaks out of blocks and hoist to the top, tracking down where a value changes is incredibly difficult. So here's another version of how you can actually see the comparison of all 3. So this is why we switch to let and const. So look at the scope row. var is function scoped. It leaks to the parent, just like Python variables often do. Let and const are block scoped, meaning they respect the walls. So they respect the curly braces that you have. So everything that's happening there is going to stay there. And if you make it in the room, it stays in the room. This makes JavaScript safer and more predictable. And as we know, let can change over time, right? If you declare it once, and you change it down the road, you can do that. But const, you can actually have that immutable, so it's not going to change at all. But if you're still confused on the difference between var and let, just know var does not respect the block scope, whereas let does. So does const. Const stays immutable. Let can change over time, but var will jump out of that block scope and really change your code as you move down it. So at the end of the day, I would recommend that you use let and const only and see the positive impact behind it in your organization. With that said, let me know your thoughts down below, and thanks for watching, y'all.